We're back with part 5 of this week's reading of the Messianic Jewish Family Bible, Tree of Life Version, TLV, and we are going to read the second part of chapter 10, which is entitled Solomon's Splendor. Now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, besides what was from the merchants, from the traffic of the traders, and from all the kings of Arabia and the governors of the region. King Solomon made 200 full body shields of beaten gold, 600 shekels of gold on each shield, and 300 small shields of beaten gold, 3 minas of gold on each shield. The king put them in the forest house of Lebanon. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with refined gold. There were 6 steps to the throne, and the throne had a back with a rounded top, and there were armrests and on each side of the seat, and 2 lions standing beside the arms. 12 lions were standing there on the 6 steps, 6 on each side. Nothing like it had ever been made in any other kingdom. All the King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all of the vessels of the forest house of Lebanon were of pure gold. None was of silver. They did not count for anything in the days of Solomon, for the king had a Tarshish fleet at sea with Hiram's fleet. Once every 3 years to Tarshish, the Tarshish fleet came, bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. So King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth in wealth, as well as in wisdom. All the earth sought an audience with Solomon to listen to his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. They brought each man his gift, vessels of silver and gold, robes, weapons, spices, horses, and mules, so much year by year. Solomon accumulated chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, and he stationed them in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. Also, the king made silver as common as stones in Jerusalem, and cedars as plentiful as sycamore trees in the foothills. Solomon's horses were brought from Egypt and from Keva, which is Keveh. The king's merchants would buy them from Keva at a price. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150, and in turn they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Aram, which is Syria. And that's the end of chapter 10. Chapter 11. There's 2 parts in chapter 11. First is the decline of Solomon, and then the prophecy to Jeroboam. So the first part is the decline of Solomon. Now, King Solomon loved so many foreign women besides the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom Adonai had said to the children of Israel, "You shall not associate with them, nor they associate with you, for surely they would turn your heart away after their gods." Solomon clung to them for love. So he had 700 wives as princesses and 300 concubines, and his women led his heart astray. For it came about as Solomon grew old that his wives led his heart away after other gods, so that his heart was no longer wholly devoted to Adonai his God, unlike the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of Adonai and did not fully follow after Adonai, unlike his father David. At that time Solomon also built a high place for Chemosh, the detested thing of Moab, on the mountain near Jerusalem, as well as for Molech, the detested thing of the children of Ammon. Thus he did for all his foreign wives who were burning incense and offering sacrifices to their gods. So Adonai became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from Adonai, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. He had commanded him about this, that he should not go after other gods, yet he did not keep what Adonai had commanded. So Adonai said to Solomon, "Since you have done this, and did not keep my covenant and my statutes that I commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for David your father's sake, but I will tear it away from the hand of your son." Yet I will not tear away the whole kingdom, but will give one tribe to your son for my servant David's sake and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." Then Adonai raised up an adversary to Solomon, Hadad the Edomite of the royal line in Edom. Earlier, when David was at war with Edom, Joab, commander of the army, went up to bury the slain and had struck down every male in Edom. Joab and all Israel remained there 6 months until he had cut off every male in Edom. But Hadad and some Edomites, servants of his father, had fled to Egypt while Hadad was a small boy. Setting out from Midian, they came to Paran and took men from Paran along with them and went to Egypt to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave him a house, allotted him food, and gave him his land. Then Hadad, now I believe in the King James it's Ben Hadad. It's just Hadad here in the Messianic Jewish Family Bible. Then Hadad found great favor in Pharaoh's eyes, so that he gave him his own sister-in-law, the sister of Queen Tahpenes, as wife. The sister of Tahpenes gave birth to his son Genubath. Tahpenes weaned him in Pharaoh's palace, and Genubath remained in Pharaoh's palace among Pharaoh's sons. Now when Hadad heard in Egypt that David slept with his fathers, and that Joab, commander of the army, was dead, Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Let me leave so I may go to my own country." Then Pharaoh replied to him, "What do you lack with me that all of a sudden you seek to go back to your own country?" "Nothing," he answered. "Nevertheless, let me go anyway." Then God raised up another adversary against him, Rezon, a son of Eliada, who had fled from his lord King Hadad Ezer of Zobah when David killed them. He then gathered men to himself and became the leader of a marauding band that went to Damascus and dwelt there and gained control in Damascus. Rezon, Rezon, was an adversary to Israel all the days of Solomon, adding to the trouble that was Hadad. He despised Israel while he reigned over Aram, which is Syria. Prophecy to Jeroboam. Then there was Jeroboam, son of Nebat. The name of his mother, a widow, was Zeruah, Zeruah, an Ephraimite of Zerida. Though he was Solomon's servant, he also raised a hand against the king. Now, the reason that he raised a hand against the king was this: Solomon built Millo and closed the breach of the city of his father David. Now, the man Jeroboam was mighty of strength, and when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he appointed him over the entire labor force of the house of Joseph. It was around that time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem that the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him on the road. Now Ahijah had covered himself in a new cloak, and the two of them were alone in the field. And Ahijah seized the new cloak that was on him, tore it into 12 pieces, and said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself. For thus says Adonai, God of Israel, behold, I will tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand, and will give 10 tribes to you. But he will have one tribe, for my servant David's sake, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. For they've abandoned me, and have worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemos, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of the children of Ammon. They have not walked in my ways, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my statutes and my ordinances as his father David did. Nevertheless, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will keep him as ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose, because he kept my mitzvot and my statutes. Yet I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand, and I will give it to you, the 10 tribes. To his son I will give one tribe, so that my servant David may have a lamp every day before me in Jerusalem, the city that I chose for myself to put my name there. So I will take you, and you will reign over all that your soul desires. You will be king over Israel. Then it will be, if you obey everything I command you, and walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes, keeping my statutes and my mitzvot, as my servant David did, then I will be with you, and will establish you a lasting dynasty, as I did for David, and I will give Israel to you. So I will for this afflict David's seed, but not for all days. Therefore Solomon sought to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam got up and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt. He remained in Egypt until the death of Solomon. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did in his wisdom, are they not recorded in the book of the Acts of Solomon? So the days of Solomon's kingship in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Then Solomon slept with his father and was buried in the city of his father David, and his son Rehoboam was king in his place. So there's a lot brewing here, as you can see, and there's a lot coming up uh, for next week, as we will see. The kingdoms go through so many hands; it's unbelievable. So, chapter 12, Rehoboam's foolishness. Then Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel and had come to Shechem to make him king. Now, when Jeroboam son of Nebat heard about it, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from the face of King Solomon and settled in Egypt. They summoned him, so Jeroboam and all the congregation of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, Your father made our yoke burdensome. Now therefore lighten the harsh labor of your father and his heavy yoke which he laid on us, and we will serve you. He said to them, Go away for 3 more days, and then come back to me. So the people departed. Then King Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, How do you advise me to respond to these people? They spoke to him, saying, If you will be a servant to this people today, serving them, granting them their petition, and speaking favorably to them, then they will be your servants forever. But he rejected the counsel the elders had given him, instead consulting with the young men who grew up with him and stood before him. So he asked them, How do you advise me to respond to these people who have spoken to me, saying, Lighten the yoke that your father has laid on us? The young men who had grown up with him spoke to him, saying, Thus you should say to these people who spoke to you, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy, but you made it lighter on us. Thus you should say to them, My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. So now my father laid on you a heavy yoke, and as for me, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but as for me, I will chastise you with scorpions. Then Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the 3rd day, as the king told them, saying, Come back to me on the 3rd day. The king answered the people harshly. He rejected the counsel the elders had given him, and spoke to them according to the counsel of the young men, saying, My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. Well, that was a really wrong thing for him to do. And as we see in the second part of chapter 12, 10 tribes revolt. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of events from Adonai fulfilling his word which Adonai spoke by the hand of Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam son of Nebat. But when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, What share have we in David? No inheritance in Jesse's son? To your tents, O Israel, now look down at the house of David. So the Israelites departed to their tents, but as for the children of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah, Rehoboam ruled over them. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was over the forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. Then King Rehoboam hurried to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. Israel has rebelled against the house of David to this day. Now, when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they summoned him to the assembly and made him king over Israel. Thus, the prophecy in chapter 11 has come to pass. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. When Rehoboam arrived in Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah as well as the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 select soldiers to fight against the house of Israel in order to restore the kingship back to Rehoboam, son of Solomon. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, saying, Speak to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, saying, Thus says Adonai, you are not to go up or fight against your brothers, the children of Israel. Turn back every man to his own house, for this matter is from me. So they heeded the word of Adonai, They turned and went back according to the word of Adonai. Then Jeroboam rebuilt Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and resided there. From there he went out and built Penuel. Jeroboam resorts to idolatry. Well, he doesn't do what's right in the sight of God right from the get-go, as we're going to see. But Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom may return to the house of David if this people keep going up to offer sacrifices in the house of Adonai at Jerusalem. Then the heart of these people will turn back to their lord, to King Rehoboam of Judah. Then they will kill me and return to King Rehoboam of Judah. So the king sought counsel and made 2 golden calves. And if one wasn't enough way back in the day when during Moses' time, this dude goes and makes 2 of them. Unbelievable. He said to them, you have been going up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Then he set one up in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Now this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one even up in Dan. He also made shrines on the high places and appointed priests from among the people who were not sons of Levi. Then Jeroboam instituted a festival in the 8th month and the 15th day of the month, imitating the festival that is in Judah. He went up to the altar that he built in Bethel to sacrifice to the calves that he had made. He installed in Bethel the priests of the high places that he made. Then he went up to the altar which he had made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 8th month, in the month that he had made up from his own heart, and made up a festival for the children of Israel, and went up to the altar to burn incense. So what he was doing was all counterfeit to what Adonai had appointed. So I'm going to briefly give some little nuggets here, as well as recapping everything that we've done so far. Talking about Solomon and his attributes, his strengths and his weaknesses. Solomon was anointed as king prior to David dying. Solomon started off on good footing with the Lord, and he was very humble. He had been raised in the kingdom and was a witness to his father's love, obedience, and respect for the Lord. Now, Solomon, he loved the Lord and was walking in the statutes of David, his father, only he sacrificed and burnt incense in high places. This is how he started out. And the Lord did speak to Solomon in a dream, and Solomon spoke to God, telling God that he was a little child and knew not how to go out and come in. This was at the beginning of his reign. He realized, being made king, that he had big shoes to fill after his father David. He was very humble, and he asked God for wisdom and an understanding heart to judge the people, to be able to discern good and bad. Solomon was completely humble in his request to God, and God was pleased with him. And not only did he grant this to Solomon, he also gave him riches. And Solomon was the richest and wisest man to ever exist. God did tell him that if he remained humble and obedient and walked faithfully in his statutes, he would lengthen his days. And Solomon started out wanting to be a good king, and he was pleasing to God. He didn't ask God for riches, long life, or anything that would boost his own image and pride. He asked to have wisdom and a heart for the people. He was humble, wise, and able to rule fairly, and God did reward him with wisdom, riches, and long life. He fell short later as he grew older, and he did not please God as he fell into idolatry. So God permitted Solomon to build the temple and increased his wealth. This was a promise God made to David, that Solomon would be permitted to build the temple to honor him. David was not permitted due to all the blood that was on his hands through war. God had promised that Solomon would not face all of this, and he would be the one allowed to move forward with the building of the temple. Later in life, Solomon fell short and began marrying foreign wives who worshiped false gods. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away from God after other gods, and this was evil in the sight of God. Now imagine that. How can you can't even spend a whole solid day with one person having thousand, dealing with 1,000 women. So that's very interesting. Solomon did not repent. He offered sacrifices in high places and made places for his wives to sacrifice to the false gods. The Lord said because he did not keep the statutes and covenant, he would take the kingdom from him. But because of his promise to David, he would not do it while Solomon was alive. Solomon's son Rehoboam also did evil in the sight of God. So while Solomon was yet alive, God stirred up enemies, Hadad the Edomite, and later Rezon. Solomon should have expected this because God told him it would happen. God had also told him that he would remain blessed if he was faithful and followed the statutes and covenant. Solomon failed to stay faithful to God later in life, and he was well aware of the consequences that would follow. The kingdom of Israel was split into Judah and Israel after the death of Solomon. So there was a northern and a southern kingdom. This was God's judgment because of Solomon's sins. Rehoboam was Solomon's son, and he ruled over Judah with Jerusalem as the capital. Only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin were in this kingdom. This was the southern kingdom. Jeroboam, son of Solomon's servant, was put in charge of the house of Joseph by Solomon. Jeroboam became the king of Israel. Samaria was the capital of Israel. This was the northern kingdom, and the northern tribes refused to accept Rehoboam as their king. The other 10 tribes were in this kingdom. And I'm going to pause it now and come back with the next part.